Tomorrow will mark another grim milestone in the war in Ukraine. 500 days since Russia launched its brutal invasion. Since the start of the war, the UN estimates that more than 9,000 civilians have died and nearly 16,000 others have been injured, though the UN also says those numbers are likely considerably higher. The UN also estimates that more than 5.9 million people have been internally displaced in Ukraine. With NATO's leaders set to convene next week, President Zelensky is pushing for a, quote, clear signal from the alliance that Ukraine is on track to join the defense pact. Meanwhile, the Biden administration announced a controversial decision earlier today, saying it would provide cluster bombs to Ukraine as it pushes ahead with its counteroffensive campaign. This is what National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan had to say this afternoon, just ahead of the administration's formal announcement.
We recognize that cluster munitions create a risk of civilian harm from unexploded ordnance. This is why we've deferred the decision for as long as we could. But there is also a massive risk of civilian harm if Russian troops and tanks roll over Ukrainian positions and take more Ukrainian territory and subjugate more Ukrainian civilians because Ukraine does not have enough artillery. That is intolerable to us.
And moments ago, at an event at the White House, President Biden was asked by reporters on the decision to send cluster munitions to Ukraine now, and his response is that they're running out of ammunition. For more on this, I'm joined now by Courtney Kube at the Pentagon. So Courtney, explain to me, what about these cluster bombs make them so controversial, and how soon could we see them in Ukraine?
So it's the dud rate is really the problem here. That's why many nations, more than 100, have actually outlawed these munitions. So what that means is these are ammunition that when it explodes, it releases a bunch of small little bombs or munitions. They're often called bomblets. They have two main missions. One is anti-armor, so it's a shape charge that essentially can pierce an up-armored vehicle. The other is anti-personnel. That is what we often hear the military talking about, frags or fragmentation. Essentially, those are the munitions that explode into even smaller pieces. Think about that when it impacts a body, Ryan. Of course, it has the potential to injure or kill anyone in its path. So these munitions, when they release these bomblets, depending on the type of cluster munitions, some of them have a very high dud rate, meaning that the bomblets don't immediately explode. These have the potential to cause catastrophic destruction to someone, a civilian, even a child, who may stumble upon them weeks, months, even years later. That's one of the reasons that human rights groups and many nations have condemned the use of these sorts in the battlefield. Now, I should say, the U.S. says that the version that they're going to send has a very low dud rate, somewhere in the neighborhood of 1.5% to about 2.5%. As opposed to some of the other ones that we've seen, according to the U.S., the ones that the Russians are using have somewhere in the neighborhood of 30 to 40%. That means that nearly half of those that the Russians are using on the battlefield in Ukraine have the potential to not explode when the bomblets, when they're fired off, Ryan.
Yeah, and Courtney, you mentioned that there are other countries who are opposed to the use of this type of weapon. Some of them are NATO countries, and of course the president is going to be with some of these NATO countries next week. Will he get some pushback from these countries because of making this decision?
And not just NATO countries, but I mean, we're talking about the closest U.S. allies who are part of NATO, who are opposed to the use of these weapons. Now, the U.S., before they announced this today, they spoke to most of these countries. Many of them, they reached out, they gave them a heads up that this was coming. The officials I've been speaking to here say, look, these allies have said they're against the use, but they don't expect any widespread public pushback on it. There's a real recognition here of exactly what we heard from President Biden just moments ago, that Ukraine needs ammunition. These have the ability to essentially fill a bridge where the Ukraine right now has a real deficit in artillery rounds, particularly 155 rounds. This will be something that they can use in that place while the U.S. and other nations really ramp up production of the artillery rounds so they can keep Ukraine in the fight.
Okay. Courtney Kube at the Pentagon. Thank you so much for that, Courtney.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.